Okay, events in Florida evoke another high-stakes race nearly 2 decades ago, the 2000 Florida presidential recount. Could Democrats be seeking a more successful replay of that election? Glenn Blackwell is a former Ohio Secretary of State and senior fellow with the American Civil Rights Union. The ACRU took part in the 2000 recount fight and, more recently, sued Broward County's election supervisor for not adhering to federal law to keep accurate voter rolls. Man, were they ahead of their time. The case is now before the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. Ken Blackwell, great to see you. Ken, I laugh when other networks or other channels or commentators say that Republicans are trying to suppress the vote. What are you talking about? The voting day is over. They're the ones who didn't hit the bar they were supposed to. And now when Republicans say, why are we still counting votes? They say that Republicans are being aggressive, trying to change a verdict. Rick Scott was up by 40,000.
Oh, absolutely. Look, the forces on the left, the Democrats and their allies are trying to push this to what I call within the margin of litigation. They are manufacturing voters, and they're doing it with an architect, Superintendent Snipes, who has a record of gross incompetence and fraud. And it is a shame that she's still in this position, given the fact that through her own admission, she lacks the management skills to provide an election that has integrity and has the confidence of the voters. Brian, look, at the end of the day, what's going on now is akin to a banana republic and a failed state. And that's a shame, because the people of Florida, the legitimate voters who came out and voted, cannot have their legitimate ballots negated by corruption, fraud, and voters who are being manufactured.
Ken, you're one of the few people that I'm going to be speaking to tonight or for the next few weeks that knew how bad this was before the election and was actually taking action against it. How do we get to this point where she still had a job, that Broward County wasn't straightened out, that 67, 66, or 65 other counties got their act together, won electronic after the embarrassment of 2000, and this one still hangs in the balance?
Well, look, let me go to the Bible on this one. In John 3, there's a saying, those who would do evil love the darkness. We have been pushing for transparency, and there has been a great resistance to that transparency. And so in the shadows, we are now witnessing the manufacturing of voters. We're seeing a welcome mat to Voters Without Borders. And as a consequence, what we have now at risk is the integrity of the election that could change the course of governance in America.
Well, the documents did come in as the judge demanded today. They do not know how many ballots. The Scott camp is now counting them. By noon tomorrow, Broward County has to come up with a decision on who voted for whom and how many. We still do not have the overseas and military ballots. That's typical. We don't know if we're going to have to dip into them.
Absolutely, Brian. Look, the great Vince Lombardi used to always say his teams never lost a game. Sometimes the clock just ran out on them. Well, if you look at what's going on in Broward County, what they're basically saying is that they don't lose elections because they don't let the clock run out until they manufacture the voters that they need to win the election. That's just crazy.
2 quotes. You gave me John and you gave me Vince Lombardi. Good job. Thanks a lot, Ken Blackwell. Appreciate it.
Good to be with you.
Meanwhile, protesters in Florida are denouncing Brenda Snipes. You saw that, split the screen with them there. I should have explained that to you. People going crazy. The Broward County Supervisor of Elections.
Supervisor of corruption! Supervisor of corruption! Supervisor of corruption! Supervisor of corruption! Supervisor of corruption!
So who is Brenda Snipes, and why is she provoking such a strong reaction? Why does she still have a job? Lisa Booth is a senior fellow at the Independent Women's Voice. She joins us right now from undisclosed location. I just saw you, Lisa. Why aren't you in studio?
I'm in D.C. visiting family.
All right. You're supposed to check in with me with that. So, Lisa,
I'm sorry.
Who is this woman?
Well, to your former guest comment, she was appointed by Jeb Bush in 2003, but she is a Democrat, and she has been elected ever since to the position of the supervisor of elections for Broward County. Now, Broward County is the second most populous county in the state. It is also the most Democrat as well. And it's not just Republicans who have been critical of her either. The Miami Herald called Broward County the most controversial department of elections in Florida. So she's also received wide criticism from all around, really dating back to even 2004, where she failed to send out, I think it was something like over 50,000 absentee ballots from individuals who had requested them. But also just look at what happened in this year alone. A judge just ruled that she was in violation of public record laws from Florida for not fulfilling Rick Scott's campaign's request. You also go back to May, and a federal judge found that she was in violation of both state and federal law for illegally destroying ballots in regard to a 2016 primary between Debbie Wasserman Schultz and a Bernie Sanders guy who sued. And mind you, the destroying of these ballots happened in the midst of a lawsuit she was facing regarding public records request regarding those ballots. So that's kind of sketchy. And then you also go back to August, and a judge ruled in favor of the Florida GOP that she was privately looking at absentee ballots so that they couldn't be contested or looked at by other people. A judge ruled in favor of the Florida GOP regarding that. She's also gotten in trouble for releasing voting information 30 minutes prior than the closing of the polls.
And that was 2016.
2016. When that was actually the same primary where she got in trouble for destroying the ballots with Debbie Wasserman Schultz. So there's been a whole thing, even dating back to 2004, that she has received criticism over, and it's not just from Republicans.
Lisa, not only is she doing a bad job, almost anybody else in the state could be doing a better job. So I asked the governor's office, I said, why isn't she fired? And they said it's a lot harder to fire somebody if they're elected. So it's much more complicated than, let's say you or I, we can get fired right away, But I guess it's a little different there. Bottom line is, that's where the focus is. It's an extremely blue area. You cannot blame the Scott camp for being worried. Well, Final thought?
Well, he could have removed her for incompetence. There's precedent for that. The person that was in that job before her was removed for that very reason. My understanding is that's not really the approach of the, Rick Scott administration. But I think it's very clear she's incompetent, and there's a lot of questions regarding what she's doing in Broward County. All
right, let's see. Tomorrow, Saturday at noon, we're supposed to get the totals. Hopefully we can move forward from there. Lisa, thanks.
Thanks, Brian. Have a good night.
Broward County came up with 78,000 more votes after the election night. How did Palm Beach County come up with 15,000 more votes? They can't tell us where they came from.
All of a sudden they're finding votes? You mean after the election they're finding votes?
We believe when every legal ballot is counted, we'll win this election. Votes are not being found, they're being counted.
He sounds normal, regularly. There you see Florida Senator Bill Nelson and Governor Rick Scott and the president. Why? Because this is all heading to a recount, and it's getting nasty down there. These are the latest numbers, a difference of 0.18%. That mandatory manual recount looks like it's going to happen when it's certified tomorrow. And the governor's race, it's headed to a machine recount at first, but we don't know. There may be more ballots out there, and if it gets under 0.25%, it'll be a manual recount too. Now, just tonight, a judge ruled in favor of Rick Scott, ordering the defendant to have the supervisor's staff, this is about Broward County, review the duplicate ballots together with representatives, basically saying the Broward County supervisor needs to show her cards and her ballots and what the process is. We've been around this before. Trust me. Let's bring in our panel. Charles Hurd, opinion editor for The Washington Times, A.B. Stoddard, associate editor at Real Clear Politics, and Josh Kraushaar, the political editor for The National Journal. Okay, Josh, it looks like there are teams of lawyers already getting in position down there.
President Trump is trying to frame this as an issue of fraud, but it really is an issue of incompetence. And the Broward County Election Commissioner doesn't even know how many more ballots are left to count.
Or she doesn't want to say.
Doesn't want to talk to the press. I mean, transparency is so important in our election process, understanding where the votes are coming from, when they were cast, and there's a basic inability for the elections officials in these two key counties not to give that information to the press or to the campaigns.
Senator Marco Rubio has been very active on Twitter on this, saying not very comforting to Florida voters that Broward County supervisor, in whose hands may rest the outcome of the Senate and cabinet race, has in the past illegally destroyed ballots, secretly opened mail ballots, sent voters too many ballot pages, left constitutional questions off the ballot. Here is the Broward County election supervisor, Brenda Snipes.
All vote-by-mail ballots have been opened, and they are in the tabulation room for processing. Provisional ballots we're going to deal with this afternoon at 5.
Supervisor Snipes shall allow for the immediate inspection, copying, photocopying of the requested records. And this is information that should have already been compiled, already be within the system. And if it's not already in the system, that's a whole nother issue.
So, I mean, this is a process question here, AB. When we're going to get to the end of the counting.
Well, we don't know because there could be more challenges and more questions. There are definitely questions about this process and about Brenda Snipes and her record on the job. And it really is a question, I think, for Rick Scott and why he didn't replace her before this close and contentious election. He has won the court has decided in his favor, and she's going to have to access these ballots and show her hand. But the idea, on the other hand, of painting a broad brush across the country that Arizona is questionable, there's rampant fraud, as Josh pointed out, everywhere, that the president is doing is exactly the opposite of what he's supposed to be doing. We need whatever trust is left in these systems and this process to be maintained. It is his job to not be pit bull in chief. He has Rudy Giuliani and people to run around Twitter and make all these false accusations. But what they're doing in Arizona is just fine. They are counting the votes, and people need to pay attention to either the real difference between what the discrepancies are in Broward County, where they had this funky design where you couldn't even see the Senate race.
Yeah.
And it's
new ballot
it's
down
just
there.
a mess. And rightfully so to ask these questions, but that doesn't mean that every system everywhere in this country is riddled with
So
fraud.
Arizona, you mentioned, we're getting vote totals, another dump at 7 p.m. Eastern, but as we're going through the day, that race is also tightening, 0.49% difference. Kirsten Sinema with a slight lead right now, as there's some 475,000 ballots still uncounted in Arizona, Charlie.
Yeah, well, and obviously there is a difference between what's going on in Arizona and California in some of those races and in Florida. But the problem is that as Josh pointed out, whether it's fraud or incompetence, it's not working right, and it's a real problem. And the idea that at the end of the day, at the end of election night, you think there are this many ballots have been cast, and then that should be a very simple sort of thing to know. You would think that would be the one thing that you do know. Obviously, all elections are a balance between making sure that every vote gets counted and making sure that people that aren't supposed to vote don't get to vote, because of course a fraudulent vote is disenfranchising some other legal voter, and obviously all of it really does undermine people's faith in the whole process.
It's familiar in Florida, and we thought we'd dive back into the time machine and go back to Tallahassee in 2000. Somebody was there covering it.
Attorneys for the Gore and Bush campaigns have now filed briefs with the Florida State Supreme Court as the race for the White House is still up in the air. It all remains in the hands of 7 justices inside this building. They will hear oral arguments 1 hour from each side Monday at 2 p.m. to decide whether hand recounts ongoing in Broward, Miami-Dade, and Palm Beach counties can be counted in the Florida state totals.
What happened to that kid? I was bouncing around courtroom to courtroom, Jim Engel and I in the back of a Ryder truck for 40 days and 40 nights in Tallahassee. You would think after all that time that we wouldn't be back here, but we are.
It feels like 2000 all over again, except we don't have butterfly ballots this time, but we're going to have this hand
count. We have a new ballot.
We're going to have every county is going to be doing a manual count, looking at each vote in that Senate race, and it's going to take weeks, if not months, to really get some resolution. So there is a lot of political stalemate here. Rick Scott, I think it's important to note that has a 15,000 vote lead. Usually when you have a recount of that size, 0.15% in the latest tally, it usually does hold. The Al Franken race in 2008, we're talking dozens of votes. This is tens of thousands.
This was just, 2000 was a few hundred votes.
Very close.
532 at the end. No hanging chads this time, but a new ballot.